In 1776, a group of wealthy men sat down in Philadelphia and approved one of the most influential sentences in the history of human civilization. Here is the sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is a magnificent sentence. It changed the world. The man who drafted it owned over 600 slaves across his lifetime. Thomas Jefferson did not see a contradiction in this, or if he did, he chose not to look at it directly. He was not alone. Of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 41 owned slaves. The men who wrote that all men are created equal built their economy, their plantations, their wealth, and their political power on the forced labor of people they did not consider men in the relevant sense at all. This is not a footnote to the story of America's birth. It is the story. The greatest political document in modern history and the greatest moral catastrophe in modern American history were produced by the same hands, in the same room, in the same summer. So how do you tell the story of a nation founded on a contradiction so large that it would take a civil war and more than 600,000 deaths to begin to resolve it? You start not in Philadelphia in 1776. You start in London, with a tax on tea. Here is the British Empire in the early 1760s. It has just fought and won the 7 Years' War, the first genuinely global conflict in history, against France. It has emerged as the dominant world power, and it is completely broke. The war cost an enormous amount of money. So the British government looks at its prosperous American colonies, with their farms, their trade, their growing population of about 2.5 million people, and makes what seems to it like an entirely reasonable decision. It will tax them to help pay for the war that, among other things, protected them from French expansion. The colonists see this differently. The taxes are not enormous. The Stamp Act of 1765, the first major direct tax on the colonies, is actually modest by British standards. But the colonists raise an objection that is not really about the size of the tax. It is about the principle. They have no elected representatives in the British Parliament. They did not vote for these taxes. And their objection, which becomes the rallying cry of the entire revolutionary movement, is simple. No taxation without representation. The British government finds this argument baffling. It repeals the Stamp Act. It passes new taxes. The colonists protest again. The British send troops to Boston to maintain order. In March 1770, a crowd surrounds a small group of British soldiers and starts pelting them with snowballs and ice. In return, the soldiers fire into the crowd, which causes the death of 5 men. Paul Revere produces an engraving of the event, soon known as the Boston Massacre, that shows the soldiers firing in cold blood into a peaceful crowd. This was not entirely accurate, but it is enormously effective in changing the sentiments of the people. Then in 1773, the British government does something that brings the tension roaring back. The Tea Act gives the British East India Company a monopoly on the legal sale of tea in the colonies. It actually makes tea cheaper, but it cuts out many colonial merchants and reasserts the principle that Britain can regulate colonial commerce without colonial input. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boards 3 ships in Boston Harbor and throws 342 chests of tea into the water. This incident is famously known as the Boston Tea Party. The British response is furious. The Coercive Acts of 1774, quickly renamed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, close Boston Harbor, restrict colonial self-government, and place Massachusetts under effective military rule. And this is the moment the British make their decisive mistake, because up until now the dispute is largely between Britain and Massachusetts. The Intolerable Acts make clear that what Britain is doing to Massachusetts, it can do to any colony. So the colonies do something they have never done before. They cooperate. 12 of the 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia in September 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They agree to coordinate resistance. They agree to meet again if things get worse. And as expected, things get worse. In April 1775, British troops march out of Boston to seize a colonial weapons cache at Concord, Massachusetts. At the town of Lexington, a small group of colonial militiamen stands in the road. Shots are fired. Nobody knows who fires first. 8 militiamen are killed. The British march on to Concord and back, shot at from behind trees and stone walls the whole way. By the time they reach Boston, 73 British soldiers are dead. The war has begun. The Second Continental Congress meets in May 1775. They appoint George Washington commander of the Continental Army. Washington has never commanded an army this size and has never won a major battle. He is chosen partly for his military experience, partly for his imposing physical presence, and partly because he is from Virginia, the largest colony, and the political coalition needs him. For more than a year, the Congress debates and drafts petitions to the king. King George III declares the colonies in rebellion and hires German auxiliary troops, commonly known as the Hessians, to help suppress it. A pamphlet called Common Sense, written by a recently arrived English immigrant named Thomas Paine, sells more than 100,000 copies in a matter of months. It argues in plain language that monarchy is absurd, that independence is inevitable, and that the time to act is now. It reaches ordinary people who have never read a political pamphlet before. It changes minds. On July 2, 1776, the Congress votes for independence. On July 4, it formally adopts the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's original draft includes a passage condemning King George III for perpetuating the slave trade. The Southern delegates insist it be removed. It is removed. And so, from the very first draft of the foundational document of American freedom, the compromise with slavery is already in place. But winning the argument is not the same as winning the war. The British take New York in the summer of 1776. Washington's army is routed repeatedly. By December, the Continental Army has shrunk from about 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000. They are cold, hungry, unpaid, and sick. On the night of December 25th, Washington leads his freezing army across the Delaware River and attacks the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. The Hessians are caught completely off guard. Washington captures nearly 900 prisoners without losing a single man in combat. It is not strategically decisive, but it is psychologically decisive. The revolution does not die that winter. The turning point comes in October 1777 at Saratoga, New York, where an American army defeats a British force so completely that France decides the Americans might actually win. France enters the war as an American ally, providing money, troops, and most crucially, a navy that can challenge British control of the seas. Without French support, the American Revolution almost certainly fails. In 1781, a combined American and French army traps the British commander Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. A French fleet defeats the British Navy offshore, cutting off any chance of rescue. Cornwallis surrenders. The war is effectively over. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognizes American independence. But winning the revolution is not the same as building a country. The Articles of Confederation, which have governed the states during the war, give the central government almost no power. Congress cannot levy taxes. It cannot regulate commerce. It cannot enforce its own laws. The states behave like 13 separate countries. So in 1787, delegates meet again in Philadelphia, in secret, to fix it. They arrive intending to revise the Articles of Confederation. They end up throwing them out and writing a new document from scratch, the United States Constitution. The debates that summer are fierce. How much power should the central government have? How should the states be represented? And underneath everything, the question nobody wants to say out loud but that shapes every compromise: slavery. The Southern states make their position clear. They will not join a union that threatens slavery. Without the South, there is no union. So the deal is made. Slavery is protected. Enslaved people are counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, giving slaveholding states more political power than their free population alone would justify. The slave trade is protected for at least 20 years, and the word slavery does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. The Constitution is ratified in 1788. George Washington is unanimously elected the first president in 1789. The experiment begins, and here is what the experiment actually is. For the first time in history, a modern nation is founded not on a shared ethnicity, a shared religion, or a shared monarch, but on an idea. The idea that all men are created equal and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It is a radical idea. It inspires revolutions in France, in Haiti, across Latin America, and throughout the 19th century. But the gap between the idea and the reality is enormous, and filling that gap, or failing to, is what the next 2.5 centuries of American history are about. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. It takes a civil war that kills more than 600,000 people to begin to close the gap that was written into the nation's founding documents in the summer of 1787. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. He meant it. He also owned over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime and freed only a handful of them, 2 during his lifetime and 5 in his will. He died with more than $100,000 in debt. His remaining enslaved people were sold at auction to pay his creditors. In the end, the man who wrote the sentence that changed the world could not afford to live by it.